Welcome back to Careers and Coffee Talk. I'm your host, Laura. Today's guest is someone who has helped shape one of the most influential and maybe most misunderstood roles inside modern organizations. Maggie Olson is the founder of Nova Chief of Staff, a platform dedicated to educating and developing chiefs of staff and strategic operators. Through Nova Chief of Staff, she's helping define what success looks like in one of the fastest growing leadership roles in business today. Before launching her own company, Maggie spent more than 20 years building her career across retail, food and beverage, and technology, including leadership roles at Nordstrom and T-Mobile. While she was at T-Mobile, Maggie became the first chief of staff to the president of the T-Mobile Business Group. And in that role, she built the chief of staff function from the ground up, creating the structure, defining the responsibilities, and building the systems that supported senior leadership and more than 5,000 employees. What makes Maggie's story especially interesting is that she stepped into a role that wasn't clearly defined. So she really helped build the playbook. And today she's helping the next generation of chiefs of staff and strategic operators learn how to lead, influence, and drive real impact inside their organizations. Let's get into it. Maggie, I'm so glad to have you here. Thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Yeah, I'm glad we could make this happen after a couple of times life got in the way for both of us. So we're finally here. I'm super excited. Before we get into all of this, I always have to start by asking, do you have your coffee or a drink ready?
So I have the Center for Entrepreneurship here in Nebraska, UNL, and I started with a tea today. And then just to be extra, I also have my water, soda water, by the way.
Perfect. Well, you're prepared, and I love
Yeah.
that. Well,
Yeah,
thanks again for being here. I think so originally we connected on LinkedIn, as all great relationships begin
absolutely.
these days. And for me, I think I found you just like through the algorithm. I was seeing some of your content pop up, and it was
Cool.
super relevant for me. Just being in my own, we're all on our career journey, I guess, at some
Mhm.
point or another, but looking for work over the last year. And I think that's why your content started to pop up. So I started to follow you, and then I sent you a request, and you did something that not a lot of people do, which was you sent a message back to me asking what prompted me to connect with you, which is brilliant. But to answer your question live today, the reason is I saw some of your content, and I think what resonated for me, and we're going to get into all of this, of course, was kind of the concept of like transferable skills, especially in a job search, and how, even if you haven't been, for example, a chief of staff, which we'll talk more about, those skills and that experience can be very transferable, very marketable to other roles like the chief of
Yeah.
staff role. And so I'm excited to talk about that more with you, especially the chief of staff role and what that really looks like. But before we dive into that, I always like to go kind of like way back. So come with me, if you will. Um,
Perfect.
to when you were a kid. Was there anything that you thought about being when you grew up?
I think for a long time I wanted to be a teacher. And
Yeah.
then I went through this teaching program in high school and I'd chosen the kindergarten grade, which was probably the problem because it was, just a bunch of hugs and taking care of the kids a little bit more
Uh-huh.
in the year that I was in the program. And I think I also had my mom in my ear saying, "You're never going to make enough money teaching." And so it's actually really funny because we'll get into it because I feel like now I am teaching through and through
Yeah,
all
totally.
day long. So.
Yeah, no, definitely. I was gonna ask, like, is there something totally different that you envision for yourself? But it sounds like there are elements of that that have kind of stayed with you.
Yeah, but it wasn't intentional. Like I laugh because I did not plan on teaching. I did not plan on becoming an entrepreneur. I did not plan
Hmm.
on building my own business. I was in the corporate world through and through, like buyer at Nordstrom,
Yeah.
executive development program at T-Mobile. We can talk about anything you want here, but it's just sort of roundabout happened that now I definitely consider myself a teacher and an educator.
Yeah, definitely. I think when you look back to some of those early roles, was there anything skill wise that like signs of those skills that you're using today that you kind of saw then?
I think I I've always been grateful to have strong women around me. My grandmother was one of the first female physicians in the country.
Wow.
Yeah, she thinks she only got into medical school because her name is Jean and they thought she was a man. So, who knows? But she went
But
through
she got
medical
in.
school. Yes, she got in. And then her three daughters, one of them being my mom, they have all actually been teachers their whole life. In some way or another, educators in the school
Mhm.
system or corporately. And so I've had a lot of examples of women raising their hand, asking for what they want, assuming they should be there. And I think those maybe less obvious taught principles or taught skills, like just getting to witness
Yeah.
how, my mom asked me questions. Well, were you in the room or did you ask to be? When are you going to move on to the next thing? It's like those questions led me to building the confidence that I think has helped me succeed compared to some other people who don't have examples like that. So that's kind
Yeah.
of why I'm out here telling everybody that they can do it and trying to get everybody to feel confident in themselves because it's just really one step, away for a lot of people.
Yeah, I love that. Speaking of those like earlier roles, you mentioned
Yeah.
Nordstrom and I know you've been in, different industries, right? Were there lessons that you learned that you feel like prepared you for these leadership roles?
Oh my gosh,
Tons.
absolutely. So many. I think I popped around from one buying office to another. I got promoted like 5 or 6 times within 5 or 6 years and started in one buying office, then moved to the next, then moved to the
Mhm.
next, and eventually became like a multi-channel buyer, which means in store and online. Like you're
Okay.
buying for that whole category of merchandise for the stores and online. And I started as an assistant buyer and I had never sat at a computer before and worked. I was always like running around on sales floors at Macy's, like,
Yeah.
have the store phone. I started doing customer service for probiotics at one point. So this was like a big shift to move into this corporate world with Nordstrom. And I quickly realized that I loved it. And I
Mhm.
more slowly realized that in order to be effective, you have to really get the buy-in from everybody around you before you
Mhm.
can make changes, make improvements, like build trust. So I think, as a chief of staff um, chiefs of staff go in and they have to assess the business and improve it. None of this is possible without building buy-in and building trust and focusing on relationships first. And
Yeah,
those were early lessons for me in the buying offices at Nordstrom of like, oh, I've got to like build relationships and
sure.
understand what everybody else does in order to be successful in like, okay, and now I want to try this new process. Is everybody on board? And bring everybody along with me rather than like,
Mhm.
hey, I'm good at this. I can just like go and do it. Like that's just not going to work. And that's an important early lesson for sure.
Yeah. Speaking of your time at Nordstrom, do you feel like there were certain problems or types of work that you kept getting pulled into at that time?
Well, this was the time I was at Nordstrom from, let's see, I think 2012 to 2018 or so.
Hmm.
And this was the time where online business really skyrocketed. So when it comes to like the problems in the business and the solutions and what we were working on, I think that the percent of online, like we called it penetration, like 5% online business, 95% in store, it went
Hmm.
from like 5% online to like 50% online for
Yeah.
some departments during that period of time. So, one of the interesting things that we were working on a lot during my years at Nordstrom, which was like 2012 to about 2018,
Hmm.
was the increase in online business. And when online business increases from like 5% of business to now 50% of the business, what comes with that is like having to figure out returns, return policy, quality of the product, like all of these kind of problems that you're like, wait a minute, we didn't have anything like this before. There was no issue. We were in store, like, and now we're worried about warehouses and all these things. So like tactically, logistically, it was just a big time of change for retail where we were also thinking like, gosh, there's so many less people in stores. And now
Hmm.
post COVID, I think the world is realizing that we need more experiences with each other and bringing back, maybe a mall visit here and there. But small towns are still really struggling from the shift from in store to online business because their malls are not surviving or they haven't survived. So it's hard for retailers, especially when they're public and they're answering
Yeah.
to a board and they can't just do what they want to do and, cut or grow inventory the way they want to do it. So yeah, it was an interesting time to be in retail.
So your role at Nordstrom was more of that of a buyer, is that right?
Yeah.
How do
Yep.
you feel like that set you up for eventually going to the technology sector and joining T-Mobile? And I know that was T-Mobile at that time was like 2018 or so, was really going
Mhm.
through a period of major growth and
Yeah.
transformation. So how do you feel like that set you up, and what was that transition like for you?
Yeah. I mean, as I look back on my time at Nordstrom, it was critical because every buying office, there's about 80 full price buying offices within the full price Nordstrom brand. And I was in five or six of them. And
Mhm.
I was in them each year. So I would move into a new buying office. And this is like a completely different business, different suppliers, different margin requirements, different processes, different purchase order process. Like everything is different. And I had to learn that business very quickly and improve it within a year before getting promoted to the next thing. And that included, like I spoke about earlier, like meeting the team and gaining
Mhm.
buy-in and understanding current state and then figuring out how to drive efficiency and improve the business. And that is exactly the role of chief of staff. And so thinking about how I've had that experience doing that five or six times in different businesses within 5 or 6 years at Nordstrom, it just feels like so helpful to have been able to,
Sure.
um, yeah, to navigate that and set me up for this, a chief of staff role at a big company and transitioning into T-Mobile. Um, it's not so much about the product, the industry, the technology. It's about people. It's about
Mm.
people leadership. It's about how you show up for each other. It's about how you lead people who report to you or who don't report to you, influential leadership. And those are really the tools and the skills that I brought with me to T-Mobile.
Yeah, and you joined T-Mobile as through like an executive leadership program, is that right?
Yep. Yep.
So you became at T-Mobile eventually, right? The first chief of staff to the president of the T-Mobile Business Group.
Mhm.
And from what I understand, you didn't just like fill this role that they were looking for. You really just built it from the ground up. So take us back to that. How did that opportunity come about, and how did you approach that?
Yeah, so I was recruited into this executive development program. I was in my MBA at the time. So
Okay.
while I was a buyer at Nordstrom, I was um, going to school in the evenings for 3 years getting my MBA. And it was crazy because as a buyer, we were traveling to New York 9 times a year. So I was Skyping into class from 9 p.m. to 12 a.m.
Oh
New
my
York time.
gosh.
I was in Seattle time zone for
That's
classes.
commitment.
It was crazy. Yeah. And it was a crazy like year and a half or so that was
Yeah.
happening. But yeah, the MBA program was 3 years. I got recruited during my second year, let's see, second year summer.
Okay.
And they were only looking for people who'd managed big teams before, like 50 plus employees. And
Okay.
thankfully, I'd done that. And I always tell everybody try to manage people early in your career because it will pay off in the future.
Hmm.
And five people across the country were selected for this executive development program with T Mobile out of their MBA programs. And what happened is they move you to a new place where you've never been before to lead a bunch of stores in an industry that you've never worked in. So I was in Salt Lake City leading a dozen or so stores and about 100 employees. And I was reporting on my business every single month to the senior leadership team at
Okay.
T-Mobile. So senior executives reporting my business. If things didn't go well, I was out. It was
Hmm.
very it was very competitive and high pressure. They wanted to kind of pressure test their future executives. Thankfully, I made it and I did okay. And I, really loved my time in Salt Lake City and moved back to Seattle, moved into a retail strategy role. From there, one of my friends was moving into a chief of staff role for the CEO of T-Mobile. And
Okay.
I really looked up to her. I thought her and I had some similar skill sets, but she was, so brilliant and creative and structured and all the things. And I said, Alice, like, what is this chief of staff role all about? And she's like, oh my gosh, you'd love it. Like, here's what it is. And I still didn't really get it. I didn't understand the terms. But she basically said, hey, I'll let you know if any of the other executives are hiring chiefs of staff. So a few months later, this leader was looking for a chief of staff, and chief of staff roles don't come from cold applications. It's
Hmm.
such a high trust role, and that leader's bringing on a chief of staff to like attend every meeting with them, to give them feedback, to be in the room, like all of the things. So it comes from relationship building, and I'd
Hmm.
already built relationships with many of the people on the executive team through my executive development program. We networked a bit. I'd interviewed with them. We had exposure. We were presenting our business.
Hmm.
So, it's just networking is the name of the game for chief of staff roles. And I ended up finding myself in a chief of staff role for this business leader who'd never really had one. And he was very hands off. He's like, just go do your thing. And I ended up building out what my role should look like. And I was lucky enough to be supported in hiring about 7 or 8 people on my chief of staff team to run all things back office and chief of staff for this business leader.
Okay. So as you were stepping into that role, what did you realize needed to be built then? Kind of talking about that, that didn't exist already.
Yeah, pretty much everything.
Yeah.
So I was hearing things like, from his executive team, like we're not all focused on the same thing. We're all kind of there's different priorities. We're all chasing different items. We never know
Mhm.
what we're showing up to, what the purpose of the session is. So that indicated to me really early on that I needed to probably start with the rhythm of business, which is really common for chiefs of staff to start with the rhythm of
Yeah.
business, which is, what are all the sessions, the key things that are driving the business that the leader attends. So I mapped that out and I documented current state and I started having conversations with all the leaders and the executive that I was working for. And started to absorb and connect the dots on like the lowest hanging, most high impact fruit
Hmm.
in quotes that
Yeah.
I could attack. So, if it was, hey, we need more visibility into Mike's calendar. Okay, great. I'm going to work with his EA. I'm going to deeply understand that calendar first. And then I'm going to build a template that, might take me an hour or two up front, but every week it's either the EA or me adding a few things to it, 5-10 minutes, and boom, everybody's more aligned. It's incredibly strategic through
Hmm.
administrative rigor. And I talk about that a lot in the chief of staff role. It's such a blend of being really strong administratively and also understanding how to have a important strategic impact based on that work.
Yeah.
Um, so it was a lot of tools like that, like providing visibility, aligning the teams, taking over the rhythm of business, and preparing my leader better than he'd ever been prepared before, creating a
Yeah.
brief process. And I teach a lot of this in our chief of staff certification course, but basically it's like just get in there, get your hands dirty, fix some things and see how it goes. And you're like testing and learning the whole time.
Yeah. And it sounds like a lot of that is coming in and observing and learning before making like any major changes.
Yeah, just like those Nordstrom lessons.
Yeah. You talk a lot on LinkedIn about the role of the executive assistant. Talk to me a little bit about the role of an EA versus a chief of staff. You mentioned working really closely with an EA. Talk to me a little bit about that relationship, how it works, and then how an EA can kind of set themselves up for a chief of staff role. Because I think that's a really interesting part of the, transferable skills and that sort of concept.
Yeah, there are two roles that are a bit unique in the fact that they both exist to support the business leader.
Sure.
Where if you think about HR, chief operating officer, marketing, all those roles exist to support the company. Of course, they report to the business leader and they're
Hmm.
doing the initiatives that the leader needs them to, but they exist to support the company. Chief of staff and executive assistant exist to support the leader.
Yeah.
And the biggest way to differentiate the two is to understand that the core functions of the executive assistant role are inbox, travel, expense, logistics, and scheduling.
Okay.
So tactical day to day.
Yeah.
Many EAs approach their work very strategically,
Hmm.
but the nature of their work is tactical.
Hmm.
Now, the chief of staff, the way I define chief of staff is the business leader's right hand and strategic thought partner that's essentially there to ensure they're prepared, align their team, take on important initiatives, trickle down their vision, bubble up culture, all the things, act as proxy and advisor if you're a more senior chief of staff. And really like toggle between strategy and execution, 10,000-foot view and 5-foot view all day long. So the chief of staff should understand those 5 core components of the EA role: inbox, travel, expense, logistics, and scheduling. They should be able to, see them clearly, know where the leader's going all the time, but they're not the doer, the owner of those items.
Hmm.
That's the EA. And the partnership between the two can truly move mountains because if you
Yeah.
think about it, the business leader could be traveling 4 days a week. They're probably in back-to-back meetings 5 days a week. Like there is often so much insight that a chief of staff can get from the EA. And
Hmm.
usually it is more so the chief of staff leading the EA at first, because usually the chief of staff's new and the EA has been around for a while and kind of
Right.
knows how things goes. But in a really great EA can be such a tool, vice versa for the chief of staff, because the EA can learn and support initiatives and drive things that make sense for the EA to own and take on more strategic responsibility. An EA can take on more strategic responsibility anytime, just like a high achieving employee can take on more responsibility anytime. But a chief of staff doesn't own those tactical EA functions ever.
Yeah. What do you think, looking at like an EA going, possibly moving into a chief of staff role, what do you think the biggest challenge is from going from more tactical work to going to like the bigger picture, more strategic look at things?
Yeah. So the first, the two things that come to mind are going to be perception and confidence. So when you're an EA, you're viewed as that tactical partner. You're not
Mhm.
necessarily viewed as the person that can take on high impact, high value strategic work. So it's kind of that perception concern. And then the confidence is usually even 10 times bigger than that because it's the personal internal confidence of executive assistants not feeling like they can do it or that they're going to be trusted or that they can learn and usually that's just a barrier to overcome.
Mhm.
We work on a lot of that within Nova and
Yeah.
our students, but um, there are so many executive assistants that are well suited to be chiefs of staff. Like if you think about it, they already know what it's like to support a leader, like a
Mhm.
senior level leader in a high pressure environment. They know what it's like to manage high level stakeholders. They get the nature of the work. They get the level of detail that a leader needs. A lot of people are like, hey, leader, here's my presentation. And it's so detailed. Like people who are around these leaders all the time know that things need to be very high level,
Mhm.
very quick, very, let them zoom in and zoom out. So there's a lot of wins that can be had, but perception, confidence can definitely get in the way for an executive assistant, but it's a transition that's happening, and I'm seeing it happen. I'm having conversations weekly with people who are either moving into the chief of staff role or their leader is asking them to pursue it or to learn more about it or to come find Nova for help or whatever it might be. And it's really, really cool because there's no reason why an excellent EA can't move into a chief of staff role.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is like self-imposed, imposter syndrome is something that comes up time and time
Yeah.
again on this podcast where we talk about ways to overcome that. Give us some ideas of ways that you have either overcome imposter syndrome yourself or help other people to kind of get out of their own way and be able to grow.
Yeah. I just come back to like the way to build confidence is to take action when we're not ready.
Hmm.
And we teach ourselves that we can do it after we take that action and it feels scary. And then we keep doing that. And that is how we build confidence. And we eventually realize there's like a clicking point, I think, in a lot of people's lives where they realize that they can figure anything out. Like
Hmm.
it doesn't have to be that they're the expert or that they know the answer, but that they can do it. And
Yeah.
do it, can be very general, right? Um, so I think, for me, that's definitely been the case. I've been somebody that raises my hand before I'm ready. Like I had those examples growing up. And that's what I urge other people to do too, is like raise your hand, take that step, mini or giant of taking action, and then you will surprise yourself. You don't have to know all the things on day one. You will learn them and have confidence that you can learn them.
Yeah, I want to go back to something else that you mentioned because it's kind of in the same token, right? In that being a chief of staff requires a lot of influence, and a lot of times when you don't have the formal authority, and it's
Mhm.
probably something that an EA can struggle with as well, a challenge. You've written a lot about this before. How do great chiefs of staff build trust with leaders while they're also, like you mentioned, supporting their broader organization?
Yeah, I mean, I like to say that there's no shortcut to building trust. I often use the quote, I think this was from a leader I had at T-Mobile. Just do what you say you're going to do when you say you're going to do it. I
Mhm.
don't like the under promise over deliver because chiefs of staff are such high achievers that we don't want to under promise.
Right.
But just doing what you say you're going to do when you're going to do it, focusing on building relationships first. And that looks like consistent one-on-ones with everybody on your leader's team, including your leader,
Mhm.
asking good questions, showing them that you're interested and invested in what's going on, starting to take like mini action on things. Um, and then over time, like you connect the dots and you have to speak up to show that you're connecting the dots. And that really will lead to building trust. And if you're networking with everybody on their team, you're also kind of like politically like placing yourself in a good spot because anytime, and I talked about this with the EAs, if that leader is going to go promote the executive assistant, they're going to talk to all of their direct reports first about it and see
Mhm.
how they all feel. So we've got to be kind of playing that game and making sure that
Mhm.
we're networking. And those conversations can look like getting to know them personally. What do they do on the weekends? What are their kids' names? And
Mhm.
it can move into what are the top priorities that you're thinking about right now? Where are you struggling? Like, what are you focused on? What would be an area that you would suggest I dive into to learn your business a little bit more? Through those conversations, a chief of staff, an EA, anybody is going to start to zoom out and be able to spot patterns across
Mhm.
everybody on the team. And then they're going to realize what they're best suited to solve based on the biggest most important things going on in the business. So it's critical to the role really to be building that trust and networking, and all of that is influential leadership. It all is. Like most of the time, those executives are a few ranks above you, and you're still needing to get them to do a lot of stuff for you. Um, and yeah, it can be tricky, but having those consistent one-on-ones and building the trust
Yeah.
constantly is important.
Yeah, building that credibility, establishing the relationships, doing what you say you're going to do. I think that's all just
Yeah.
goes back to like relationships and credibility.
Hmm. Hmm.
So you built this function, right? And you helped define the role of chief of staff inside a major company. At what point did you start thinking about how that information and that knowledge could help other people?
Yeah, I think I realized through my time as a chief of staff, I was there for about 2 years. And as I mentioned, hired on 7 or 8 different people. I kind of realized that I was like inventing the template every time or recreating creating from scratch, like the tool or the process or
Hmm.
whatever it was. And I did have another person in my organization that I would call and ask how they approach things. And, they might have a template, but I always had to make it my own. And it just, there was nobody to call. And
Hmm.
it wasn't until I was done really with that role, ready to move on to what was, maybe coming next. I didn't know. I thought I might consult. That I was sitting on the couch in New Mexico with my mom talking about how crazy it is. There's thousands of project management certifications that exist out there in the world and absolutely nothing for chiefs of staff. This was
Hmm.
about 3.5 years ago. And she was like, well, honey, why didn't you go build it? So I was like, okay. And for the next year, I was pregnant building a course. And now we've really blossomed into a training and education company.
Yeah. What were you hearing from other chiefs of staff that made you realize the need was bigger than just your own experience? Like what were they looking for?
It was just everyone was always talking about how they felt like they were on an island alone.
Yeah.
And I quickly realized that like the cool part about the chief of staff role is the day to day is different everywhere. But as somebody trying to build content for people to learn, I zeroed in on the fact that the core purpose of the role is the same everywhere. That
Yeah.
core purpose that I described, preparing your leader, aligning the teams, all those things, like you're doing that, whether you're in food and beverage, you're on a sports team, you're in tech.
Hmm.
And so that's really what I built. And I had just finished building out every function on my team, all the people, the processes, the tools, the templates. And I basically turned all of that into a course.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, was shocked by the how it was received.
Yeah, I mean, building anything is a huge undertaking, right? I mean, as you know, I think when you look at how your company is helping to shape how organizations, like you said, across sectors, are thinking about this role specifically, what are you seeing when it comes to chief of staff? Like, what are the similarities, differences? Because you mentioned it's kind of it's a template no matter where you are.
Yeah, it can really, really vary from seniority level. You can be a
Hmm.
very junior chief of staff. You could be
Okay.
fresh out of school, but you're like a go-getter and you are trusted and you just go get things done, figure it out. And you can
Yeah.
be extremely senior, like as experienced industry specifically as a business leader or a CEO. That means you could range from junior manager, director, all the way to VP or executive in the chief of
Hmm.
staff role. And your pay can range too.
Hmm.
Um, you also can really vary from a title perspective. So chief of staff is only accepted. I mean, it's pretty minimal, like probably 10, 15, 20% of the time, chief of staff title is actually in use correctly for the role. Um, there's 40 plus different titles out there that exist to describe chief of staff work. And those could be things like business planning, business strategy, business partner. I mean, it just goes on and on.
Hmm.
And a lot of times people don't realize they're a chief of staff
Yeah.
until they start listening to, oh my gosh, those are all the things I do. And I do it for a human rather
Yeah.
than the business. And
Yeah.
that's what we're like, hey, that's okay. You can have a different title as long as you understand the work you're doing and how to find the resources to support you. And you have a bit of a charter for how what success looks like. Like the title doesn't matter.
Yeah. Why do you think that this position has become so it's you're seeing it more and more, right? Where I think maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago there wasn't really a chief of staff role. So why do you think it's become so important in organizations today?
Well, I think that, every leader has an executive assistant, they have that tactical partner. And the more that have that strategic partner, somebody who's focused on the most important initiatives that a business leader has that have nowhere else to land, they don't
Hmm.
belong in marketing, they don't belong in HR, they
Yeah.
don't know where to put them. Who's going to own them? They need a
Yeah.
strategic, high level person, and they need someone kind of chasing down their team and making sure that everything is prepared and planned and organized and people showing up right, but they need somebody to be operating at the higher level to do that.
Hmm.
And honestly, I think that like business owners are like, hey, do you have a chief of staff? Because you should have one. Mine's great. Like they're just
Yeah.
talking to each other.
Yeah.
Like you
Yeah.
need a
Yeah.
chief of staff. I have one. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I like to believe that all my yelling on LinkedIn is helping too.
Let's hope.
Yeah,
And they're aligning it all too, right? Like it's not just the prep and all of that, but they're making sure everything is working in a cohesive manner, right? Um,
absolutely.
what are some of the big misconceptions when it comes to the chief of staff role as people are learning more about it and more leaders are looking for a chief of staff and of course interacting with your content on LinkedIn?
Yeah, I think probably two come to mind. The biggest is that chief of staff is administrative, or it's like a quote glorified EA or something like that. We
Yeah.
touched on that. Administrative rigor is important in most roles actually to be able to structure
Yeah.
things and get them done.
Yeah.
But in the chief of staff role, of course, it's important, but it's a strategic role. And the other is that you need an MBA or consulting background or industry specific experience to be a chief of staff. You don't, you absolutely
Mhm.
don't. It's more about the kind of person you are, which is generally like driven, hungry, achievement focused, good at a lot of things, likes breadth over depth, has high EQ, can work with a lot of different people, okay behind the scenes. Like that's the kind of person who is really strong in the chief of staff role, someone that you can just trust to get things done
Yeah.
and works quickly versus exactly where you've been in the past.
Yeah. So a lot of people listening to this show are likely navigating their own careers, trying to figure out where they fit. For someone who might be interested in becoming a chief of staff or more of a strategic operator, as you mentioned, what skills should they really work on developing now?
I think that you should be networking consistently all the time. You should be identifying the leaders in your business that seem cool to you, that you're drawn to, that you could just sit down and have a conversation with, and you
Yeah.
reach out and say, "Hey, I'd love to talk to you about your business. Would you have 15 minutes that I could, come and chat with you?" I did that. And I
Yeah.
was in an executive development program and it felt natural because I was in this program and I was expected and told to go network with executives.
Hmm.
Anybody can do this. And then it puts you on the radar of the executives that are having conversations across a company, deciding who top talent is. Like
Yeah.
there's nothing better than, networking in that way. So I would start there. I would also consider your executive presence, consider how you show up at work, consider what people would say in rooms you're not in.
Yeah.
And tactically, project management is a big part of the executive assistant role, or excuse me, the chief of staff role. I call it executive project
Hmm.
management. Um, and so the ability to take a complex initiative, break it down into bite-sized mini projects, understand who the key stakeholders are, what the next steps are, and actually like drive movement in a project is really important. I don't think you need a project management certification,
Yeah.
but taking on some projects like that would be helpful.
Yeah, definitely. And you spent your career really building these structures that help leaders succeed and help organizations run better. When you look back at your own path, what advice would you give your younger self looking back to the beginning of your career?
Oh my gosh. I mean, it's similar to what I tell everybody now, but it's like you can do it. You should have the confidence that you can, know that you're amazing, and just like lean into it.
I love it. Where can people learn more about your work and about Nova Chiefs of Staff?
Yeah, so novachiefofstaff.com is a great place to start. We've got over 25 or 30 different free resources in our free resource library. You can also find me on LinkedIn. I post every day about the chief of staff role and on TikTok and Instagram, Maggie Olson, COS.
Well, Maggie, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to have, it's been such a pleasure to have you. And I think this is such an interesting role, such a dynamic role. And I think so many people probably don't realize that the work that they've been doing directly translates to a
Yeah.
chief of staff role. Maybe they're even in a chief of staff role, but like you said, it's called something else. And so this is a great way to learn about, potentially pursuing that further and helping an organization and a leader be successful. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing and for being here today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was fun to chat through it all.
And that's a wrap on this episode of Careers and Coffee Talk. Big thanks to today's guests for pouring out so many great insights. And hey, thanks to you for hanging out with us. If this episode gave you a little jolt of inspiration or made your day a bit more brewed and balanced, be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Got a minute? Drop me a 5-star review. It's basically the podcast equivalent of buying me a fancy oat milk latte. Quick disclaimer though, the views expressed in this episode are personal and do not reflect those of any organization. Anyway, until next time, stay curious, stay caffeinated, and keep chasing the career that makes you feel the most alive. Catch you next time.